Hello and welcome. My name is Duncan Bryan. I lead IDC's security research team in Europe, and with me is Jeff Kilford from Intel. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, good to meet you, Duncan. Yeah, I'm Jeff Kilford. I currently look after the client portfolio for Intel in the UK. But prior to that, I spent 26 years in Intel's IT organization, about 10 years in various server functions, looking after the data center and so on, and about 10 years in client. So I'm looking after the client fleet, 140,000 devices and 100,000 employees. So I've definitely been at the sharp end of managing some of those complex estates.
Very good. Nice to meet you, Jeff. So I guess the first question is, let's just jump straight in. So this is a security audience we're talking to. Why Intel?
Well, Intel's pretty unique. The ecosystem that we have generated over decades and decades of being the silicon leader for client and server. It's vast. It's very capable as well of understanding exactly what's going on in terms of threat and trends for IT organizations. So we stay very closely aligned to understanding what CISOs in particular have to cope with. And this is something that's been dramatically changing for the last 4 or 5 years. 5 years ago, I think it was more a case of how much security can we exert into the enterprise in terms of how much of the experience that consumes from the end users. That was the traditional balancing act. But there's more imperatives now that have brought the CISO from the back room into the boardroom more comprehensively. A lot of macro pressures. They're having to cope with digitally replatforming the companies that they look after. Otherwise, those companies become irrelevant. There's a lot more legislation they have to deal with. GDPR is probably just the tip of the spear. And then internally, they have to deal with these competing forces of being considered a cost center that has to be optimized. So very often they attract flat to decreased investment into the IT organization and security. Yeah. And at the same time, they've had explosive demand for their services, not just bandwidth and storage and encryption, but experiences. We passed that 50% of the workforce millennial tipping point this year. And expectations around those devices, are pretty tough. It puts a lot more pressure onto the CISO overall. So why Intel is we understand all of that. And so we orient our platforms, whether it's server or client, to put features inside that alleviate a lot of the stress that the modern CISO has to face, but to ensure that we're delivering the right experiences for the end users. So we're trying to balance those forces for them by innovating at the silicon level, using our ecosystem then to build wonderful platforms. Work very closely with operating system vendors in the ISV ecosystem as well. We've got a heritage in security. Everything is security by design or secure performance. We like to say internally, we've owned a very famous security company for good reasons and still have 49% share in that company. We think this is the modern problem that generates a huge amount of IT problems, and we want to be the solution provider of choice for that. So that's why we're baking a lot into our client and server roadmaps to deal with these forces.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I guess most of the CISO community listening will have their professional experience starting at above the operating system, so essentially at the application layer. So what's the situation so below that? A lot of people have talked about below the operating system attacks and so on. Can you just kind of map that out for us?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in 2017, if I was chatting to a CISO, I'd say things like, BIOS is going to be compromised. There are going to be attacks that sit underneath the operating system. And if you think of client in particular, do they have the toolkit that can reach down under the operating system and find that there's been an intrusion into BIOS? Probably not. Certainly not back in 2017. I talk about active memory attacks. I talk about really an era when the cybercrime industry is so tempting that you'll have state-sponsored cyber criminals intercepting and duplicating discrete components on the platform. Now, in 2017, it was all very exotic, and everyone would look at me a bit funny in the room. In 2018, we had LoJacks, and here was an insidious, widespread threat. It attacked the BIOS, and the only devices that understood it had been attacked were vPro devices at the time, because they understood the BIOS had been compromised. They don't know it's LoJacks, they just knew something had gone wrong. They don't allow the system to boot and spread the malware. So now we've got a use case, unfortunately, that has exacerbated this conversation around it's not operating system and software stack above. They're super important, and 90% of successful malware still attacks in that area. But we're dealing now with highly motivated, well-bankrolled criminal organizations with access to fabrication technologies. And we've got to build technologies in there that allow the CISO to have confidence in their supply chain, their third parties, their employees who are now, working from home outside the firewall. And we've got to build those capabilities for them so that they can get on and think about the next thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, do you think that awareness within the CISO community of that potential vulnerability in their system and of Intel's approach to securing that, do we have the awareness yet in the community?
I don't think so yet. I think the burden of that is on Intel. We need to do a better job of continuing to talk about the features that we're putting into servers and clients and things, so that we can build that connection between actually that these modern threats can be mitigated and they can be remediated, and actually it's Intel that's driving a lot of that conversation. And the best anecdote I've got of this, Duncan, I think, is I was at a London conference, 400 CISOs. It was all about supply chain risk. We were talking about transparent supply chain, which is our solution for having that kind of authenticity of platform guarantee. And I had a lot of conversations from the CISO afterwards coming up to me and saying, we didn't think that Intel was a big security player. And it's soul destroying in a way, because everything we do is oriented around security. We employ other organizations to attack our stuff relentlessly. We offer very lucrative bug bounties. It's a very conscious process. And we've got thousands, over 10,000 software engineers internal in Intel. It's kind of we're not known as a software company, but those BIOSes, those firmware, other mitigation capabilities, the way in which the vPro platform detects issues and can remediate them, that's all thanks to an army of software developers. And then we work with the broader ecosystem. So they innovate on top of those platforms, and then the software comes on top again. So we're trying to drive the built-up story. But I guess because with the foundational layer, with the silicon guys, maybe that is not foremost in the mind of the CISO that it's us doing the work.
Yeah, no, interesting. I was just wondering, you mentioned GDPR in your opening comments, and it talks a lot about data protection by design by default, which is essentially privacy or security by design, similar concepts. Presumably what you're doing kind of resonates with that. Are you targeting the DPO community, the privacy community, as well as the CISO?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the conversations do run around, it's more than just protecting identity now and doing encryption on a hard drive, and protecting the IP of a company. The sophistication of attack, it can certainly become the issue of data, because it is in transit or at rest on so many more devices. It's a far more complex and larger ecosystem we have to engage with. So we do talk about the data protection aspects of everything that we design and everything the CISO has to worry about. We stay very closely to the legislators. Our input is not to influence, it's to understand exactly what they need to get done, and also try and think about what they need to get done in years hence. I don't think we'll ever get less legislation exerted upon us. So what do we have to build that solves the next problem that legislation will it'll be part of the mix of things that CISO has to deal with? What can we do for that CISO to ensure that it's really a non-issue? We've already gone there, we've designed it in, and so, okay, on to the next. So the idea is to try and keep that regular cadence of a little bit of crystal ball gazing as well, but stay close to the regulators and be part of that conversation, rather than be part of the audience when it's too late to really think about how we have to build these discrete capabilities into the platforms themselves.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, I guess the average CISO listening to this is going to have an installed base of laptops and servers, predominantly Intel-based, one would think. What's the migration path to get from where they are now to more secure set of devices? What is there a prioritization, or how does that all work?
Yeah, I mean, typically, the platforms we make, certainly each generation, we're going to iterate on those security features. So each generation is going to provide a new set of capabilities that are specifically built to deal with the modern threat. And so, I've spoken to probably upwards of 500 IT organizations in the last 10 years, both as an IT professional and as a sales professional. And one of the things that I noticed is those organizations that do really well at balancing the competing forces that we talked about earlier, they're the ones that have that kind of evergreen refresh for adoption of technology. They get it in, really at a point of availability. They've got great line of sight in terms of the total cost of ownership of managing that asset, and they've got tools and solutions that can exquisitely manage it as well. And at the same time, you know, the inner seam of that TCO conversation is risk. So understanding the risk profile of that asset. And then they have active end of life, not just because it'll be a horrible performance experience for the employee when it's sweated out to 5 or 6 years' time, if we're talking about clients, but because that is now an attack surface that's extremely attractive to a would-be attacker. And so those organizations, I think they're doing very well at balancing the forces. For the other IT organizations, what we try and do is we try to help them with that articulation of, you know, we think these are the fundamentals. You need to go to what is typically the CFO and say to the CFO, we've got to spend some money here because we've got to get a much better handle on our risk and our threat profile. And we've got a very at-risk environment, a very at-risk enterprise. And, you know, they might not even own the budgets, Duncan. You know, sometimes the IT organization has to go and petition money from a purchasing department. Yeah, get it in early and manage it exquisitely and get it out when it becomes dangerous. I think that's the best mechanism.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Are there any particular use cases that you think a more secure platform would be appropriate for? I mean, are there personas that I think need this capability more than others, or is this something that applies right across the board? And is it laptops, or is it servers, or is it mix, or how does that all play out?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunately the answer is everything, because that's where the data is going to spend some time, you know, it's going to be at rest, it's going to be in transit, it's going to be on a thing, it's going to be in the server, it's going to be in the cable. So this is why it's so tough, I think, for the CISO. I mean, now it's not a case of there's my perimeter, there's my people. It's heck, everybody's outside the DMZ, everybody's outside the firewall. Sure. I don't know where this individual is sending my data, you know, if we look at the current environment. And so getting a platform that's built for business, that has the very latest capabilities to protect individuals, and switching all those capabilities on, you know, in the vPro platform, if you look at Intel's client, that's for free. In the server environment, we have other discrete security technologies that, you know, they should be seriously looked at and considered in terms of what will they do for me? What's the risk of not doing it? You know, I've seen some numbers that I wouldn't feel comfortable quoting on the average cost of recovering from, you know, malware, or even worse, the brand damage associated with losing somebody's data. So it's never going to get easier, I don't think. This is probably the least amount of change a CISO has to endure. So it's now a case of how do we and our partners and the software ecosystem solve a big chunk of those problems for them so they can think about the next thing.
Very good. Jeff, we could talk about this for a long time, but I'm afraid we are out of time. So thanks very much for joining us in this fireside chat. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Duncan. Thanks.
No problem. That's it, folks. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.